Hello and welcome back to the second part of World Today here on TVP World. My name is Ashim Kumar. Today, Berlin expelled over 20 Russian diplomats from Germany. In a tit-for-tat move, Russia expelled a similar number of German diplomats. What was behind this, and does this indicate a shift in German-Russian relations? In addition, left-wing parties in Germany are divided on the support provided to Ukraine. Sarah Wagenknecht, a member of parliament for Germany's far left, broke from the mainstream and demanded an end to arms shipments to Ukraine. In this demand, she was supported by members of the far-right Alternative for Deutschland party. What brought these unlikely bedfellows together, and does Russia have any influence here? To explore this, I'm joined by Jeyson Jey Smart, political analyst and Kyiv Post special correspondent. Jeyson, welcome back to TVP World, and thank you for taking the time.
Good to see you. Thank you so much.
Good to see you too. So let's start with the expulsions. Is the German-Russian love affair over?
That's a good question. I think there's definitely been a setback. I don't know if there's a full divorce, but they're having some time alone. It seems that the Germans are definitely shifted. I mean, you remember just a few months ago, Germany was unwilling to send tanks. Before that, just months before that, it was criticized that it had promised to send some helmets and no further assistance. Today, it's supplying a great deal of help and assistance to Ukraine. And it's clear that I think the politicians in Germany understand that the risk of the war in Ukraine pouring over should Ukraine fail is real. It is in the interest of the national security of Germany to support Ukraine. And I'm glad to see that there has been a shift in the thought process that is taking place now in Berlin.
Okay, so there are a couple of issues that arise from what you've just said. So, for example, Germany's reliance on Russian energy sources hadn't completely gone away. You could still imagine them going back to Russia once the war was over and things had calmed down a bit. Has that vanished forever, do you think?
Perhaps not forever, but I think for the long term, yes, it has vanished. The fact is that once you sign these energy contracts, once you're into this for a couple of years, and once there's always already a process that you're working with other countries, other partners, there's no longer a necessity for Germany to work with Russia. And I think that Russia is going to find itself to become less and less necessary. Other than the fact that it produces oil and gas, what is it you see in the world today with all the global sanctions against that country? What do you see the world suffering from a lack of? There's very little. Russia doesn't produce a lot that people need. So if you can find oil or gas in other places, really, why do you need Russia?
Right. Well, the thing is, of course, Germany has now closed its final nuclear power station, so that might change the equation a little bit, but that's an issue for another day, perhaps. The other point that I wanted to raise, based on what you've just said, is there was some disagreement, wasn't there, in the German body politic about support for Ukraine. There was a feeling that perhaps Germany was becoming too militarized or too engaged in military affairs by supplying Ukraine. What's happened to that dissent that existed in the early days of this war?
So it is interesting is that I think that in Germany as a whole, it sort of closed the gap. There's less fear. There's always been a red line for German politics for the last 8 years about sending weapons to Ukraine. Most specifically, tanks was always the big red line. And now they are sending tanks. So we've passed that line. We've crossed Rubicon. At this point, what are we talking about? At this point, we're talking about the fact that some parties, namely Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, and the Link, which is the left, has been shown to be pushing an agenda which they call anti-war, pro-peace. In fact, this is what we now know, a Russian operation. There are documents that have come out, a number of documents, intelligence documents, that were seen by the Washington Post that shows that Russian intelligence was actively working with these pro-peace groups. Obviously, these pro-peace groups are not cognizant of the fact that they're being used, probably, at least the rank and file person in the streets in a protest. But the fact is, the reason that Russia is pushing this pro-peace agenda or anti-weapons agenda is not because it's Russia's interest in peace. It's quite the opposite. They just want to make Ukraine an easier target, and that's what these protests are really about. Is Russia is using and abusing and misleading and disinforming these populations who are showing up these protests, who are not aware of the fact that the link is being used aggressively against the interest ultimately of Germany.
Right. Well, I mean, this, I suppose, doesn't surprise us terribly. I mean, Russia has always tried to undermine the information space in different countries to cause division and perhaps, to get people to get the government on their side. So, in that sense, it's not surprising. But what is it that they've actually done to get the left and the right saying the same thing about not supplying Ukraine?
So it is funny is that it's always interesting as you look at the horseshoe of politics. You look at the left and the right's on a continuum where you have two extremes, but realistically, it does bend because ultimately you get to a certain degree of authoritarianism on both sides, a different degree of extremism, but different things might come in common that are in the interest of Russia. In this case, it's peace. Now, the idea of the left that peace might be something so simple as they wish to have peace, they're against violence. But in the case of the right, it might be something more simple, which is that it creates an immigration crisis. The war in Ukraine brings more immigrants to Germany, which is something they don't want. More than that, it's something that costs a lot of money. It's better they spend that money on German people rather than spend it on Ukrainian people or Ukrainian people's defense. But the fact is, these are all just manipulations. Russia has no interest, doesn't really care. Russia itself is responsible for immigration crisis, as you recall, just a few months before the war began in Belarus, crossing the border into Poland, as well as to Lithuania. And so I think that if we really look back at this, we see that Russia is just manipulating public opinion in these countries, knowing what those soft issues are or those touch points are that they know that they can go to, push on, and all of a sudden there's going to be a reaction in the population of a certain percent that says, you're right, that's what we need to do. And I think nuclear energy, by the way, in Germany, the Greens, who have been very strong, by the way, in supporting Ukraine, but historically, getting away with nuclear energy, who has more of an interest in that than the Russians? What else would guarantee a dependency of Germany historically than that? Getting rid of nuclear weapons, getting rid of other options, but forcing to buy from Russia. And I think that is something that's readily accessible, the information on that Russia has definitely pushed that narrative that getting rid of nuclear energy is a good idea because it serves its own economic interest, not because they care about the environment.
Right. Well, I mean, so it would seem. I mean, that would certainly fit into the Russian playbook as we've seen it so far. It's what is surprising, I would have thought, is that the German government isn't waking up to this. Or are the expulsions reflecting some kind of realization of the game being played?
The reality is that the expulsions, I think, do show that they're waking up to this. I mean, a year ago, Germany expelled about 40 diplomats when the war was beginning in Ukraine, a month or two into it. Now, we look what's going on here. It was about 30 diplomats were expelled. It's a significant number. I think in total, the estimate was that there's about 150 Russian diplomats. To expel so many is a serious blow to their bilateral relations. But I think it's the fact that Russia has showed itself to be an unreliable partner. The Germans had thought there was some sort of understanding and relationship between them. But what we've seen is quite the opposite. The Russians have always, when somebody thinks there's a friendship, have interpreted that as being a weakness. When somebody has thought there would be a peace, has interpreted that as a weakness. The Germans are now coming to really understand that the Russians were just trying to take advantage of them. There was no friendship offered to them. There was no olive branch. There was no peace. There was nothing other than the fact that they were going to be used and abused by the Russians, as typically happens.
Right. So what has the reason been given? I mean, because with earlier expulsions, the reason was Russian atrocities in Bucha. What's the reason this time around?
So it's actually very interesting. So they've not been very open about a lot of things, and even the number of diplomats who were expelled, the exact number, or at least this morning, was not clear when the expulsion was taking place. This decision was already made towards the beginning of the month, around April 5th. The German ambassador to Moscow was informed that these expulsions would take place. So this has been in the works for a while. It was only this morning, though, that the airplane arrived from Moscow to Berlin, Rosia airplane, to pick them up. And this came out sort of as a shock to everybody. I think that the Russians, perhaps in their hearts, really thought that the Germans would rethink things or they would reconsider things, but that's not the case. I mean, the Germans have had enough. And I think this is going to be a trend that we see across Europe. I mean, there's been a scandal just the past few weeks in France and other places with Russian diplomats who have behaved badly or have turned out to be abusing their diplomatic passports. In the case of France, it was the wife of the head of the intelligence service who was there on vacation, traveling around in the ambassador's car on a diplomatic passport, and she was forced to go back home. But it's because the Russians are always trying to find ways to game the system and to take advantage of Europe's generous and correct interpretation of diplomatic law.
Right. Yes. Well, I mean, again, unsurprising perhaps in terms of the Russian attitude. How is all this being seen in Ukraine? I mean, you're based in Kiev. In fact, you're joining us from there right now. How is that being taken in Ukraine? These expulsions and related issues.
Oh, of course, people understand it's a good sign. And the fact is, there was always concern that a lot of the European countries, Western European countries specifically, would not wake up to the threat that Russia poses. That there was given this sort of a naive thought that Russia, well, you just have to work with them, or they think a little bit differently, but we'll get them to go along with us. I think the countries that have had more experience with Russia, such as Ukraine, Poland, Baltic states, understand very, very well that the Russians don't want to play ball. They have no interest in being one more of the European countries or being a normal civilized nation. They like being barbarians, and they'll continue to be that way for a long time.
Right. Well, another slightly related question, different but related, and this is as follows. Since the war started, and we're talking about going back to 2014, when Ukraine started working with Western countries in a number of areas, have you noticed a shift in the structures that exist, the civils and society structures that exist in Ukraine towards EU standards, towards international standards? Because that's always been a stumbling block, hasn't it, for Ukraine joining the European Union,
Sure.
for example?
Absolutely, and I think that's absolutely the case. When we used to talk about the EU ascension process, NATO ascension process, I think it was a lot more idealistic and a lot less realistic. I think it was just in very vague, open terms that we will, one day join our European destiny without clear plans of getting there. The fact is, to join the European Union or NATO is a multi-step process, and it requires a lot of accomplishments. And you have to check off a lot of boxes, and if you don't, you're not going to get in. And Ukraine really was not doing a great job at moving through that. At this point, I think that there's a much more serious interpretation of what it means to join the European Union, what steps are necessary, and a desire to go through those accomplishments. Now, granted, due to the war, civil society, as much as they might push that, there's probably less of a prioritization, not due to a lack of political will, simply higher prioritizations in the day, such as aerial bombardments of the cities in the country by Russia. So, but the fact is, I do see that there is a shift. There is a much more serious, pragmatic desire of how to obtain a future in Europe and in NATO.
Right. Well, that's good to hear, Jason. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for taking the time to join us, and
Thank
our
you.
best regards to Kiev. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye now. And that's all from us on World Today. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye for now.